Welcome to the Continuing Education module, How Wellness Programs Create Behavior Change. We can change behavior. The agenda for this module includes our definition of wellness, behavioral targets for wellness programs, framework for behavior change, framework for habit formation, findings from major literature reviews, summary of the evidence, key best practice considerations, and a summary of key points. Our definitions of wellness include an intentional choice of a lifestyle characterized by personal responsibility, moderation, and maximum personal enhancement of physical, mental, and financial health. And this is the context for wellness that we're generally looking at as we think about this particular area. A worksite wellness program, from our definition, is an organized program in the worksite that is intended to assist employees, assist or help, and their family members in making voluntary behavior changes that reduce their health and injury risk, improve their health consumer skills, and enhance their individual wellness, productivity, and well-being. As we think about behavior change and wellness, I'd like to just touch on this particular graphic that comes from the World Economic Forum, their 2012 Global Report on Wellness. And it's why wellness is important. And as you can see, the 8 risks and behaviors that are indicated here as poor standard of care, and that, by the way, is more the behavior around consumer health education, insufficient sleep, excessive alcohol consumption, poor diet, physical inactivity, smoking, lack of health screening, and poor stress management. These 8 risks and behaviors drive the 15 chronic conditions you see listed from diabetes at the top to high cholesterol at the bottom. And they account for 80% of the total costs of all chronic illnesses worldwide. And in developed nations like the US, we spend approximately 70 to 75% of all healthcare dollars of the $3.2 trillion that were spent on healthcare in 2015 on chronic illness. So that basically makes our choice of focus on various behaviors to be important in the context of controlling and helping moderate healthcare costs for our nation. Now, as we look at the issue of behavioral targets for wellness programs, there's something that we call the Big 8, which constitutes what we consider as a reasonable core of behaviors which wellness programs should address. The first 6 of which are primarily chronic disease prevention and chronic disease related kinds of risk factors. That's tobacco, physical activity, nutrition, weight management, heart health, which includes blood pressure and the issue of cholesterol, and stress. The other 2 include a shorter term kind of economic return and a more direct impact on healthcare claims. And that's medical self-care skills in terms of handling the kinds of symptoms that we generally have as individuals and as family members, and back pain prevention activity. So from our context, the Big 8 constitutes a set of core targets for wellness programs in virtually all settings. The other risks that can be addressed, many of them in the injury risk category or injury prevention category, include the issue of sleep, distracted driving, seatbelt use, ergonomics, home safety and injury prevention, defensive driving, and recreational risk, as well as fall protection. So those other risks combined with the Big 8 constitutes, in our way of thinking of things, as really a core set of health and injury risk issues for wellness programs to address. Now, the framework for behavior change that we're using was adapted from the work of Dee Eddington, and it starts with needs and targets. There are a variety of different kinds of areas of focus that we can look at in wellness. There's a 6-step planning process, and that planning process is really the core of our WellCert approach to designing wellness programs that have a high behavioral change potential. And that involves setting your wellness strategy amongst the 3 major strategies: feel good wellness, traditional wellness and results-driven wellness, establishing an infrastructure, both an organizational infrastructure and a technology infrastructure to deliver wellness to your population. Step 3 is planning the communications and marketing activity. Step 4 is planning the many different kinds of ways we seek to allow people to track and provide feedback on their behavior change. And step 5 is looking at planning group activities, and step 6 is planning the supportive environment. So these 6 steps essentially set the stage for the development of a design for a wellness program that includes a range of interventions. And those interventions, again, are amongst a feel-good wellness set of interventions, a traditional set of wellness interventions, and the results-driven wellness interventions. The intermediate results are the next area, and so as we're implementing a variety of interventions, we then are looking for behavior change, for healthier people and indications that their health status is improved, and reporting back higher levels of productivity, more energy, more vitality, more resilience. And ultimate results indicating economic benefits, which are a return on investment, and then other benefits, which is value on investment. So the combination of the ROI and VOI constitute a balanced scorecard approach. And then the issue comes into the feedback loop, which comes back around to the types of behaviors that we're attempting to change and to influence. Now let's look at habit formation and look at the major components of habit formation. We generally have behavioral cues, and those behavioral cues are a range of issues. There may be one or more cues. They may be unique to me, or they may be common to myself and other people. But the idea is that there's also a cue which generates or stimulates or catalyzes a routine. And a routine is a set of behaviors. And those behaviors can in fact be unhealthy, or they can be healthy. So we have a routine that we're essentially trying to swap out, if you would, between the unhealthy to healthy. That routine also generates and provides reward. And that reward can be entirely intrinsic, or it can be a combination of extrinsic and intrinsic. So the idea that our habits are in fact oriented toward how often we do this cycle. So we essentially have a cue which leads to a routine, which leads to a reward. Time goes by, a cue comes back in, goes back into routine, back into reward. Most of the emerging science around habit formation tells us that the individual areas we need to focus on are making changes in the routine that we're involved in while maintaining the cue and or the reward involved. Now that may need some crafting of the cue and crafting of the reward, but the idea is that it's easier for us to change out the routine if we have some stability and continuity in the cues that are catalyzing the routine and the rewards we associate with the routine. Now, as we look at the issue of behavior change and behavioral consequences of programs, and we look at the evidence around behavior change, some of the background that we need to look at is the United States Preventive Services Task Force scientific consensus structure. And in their structure, as they look at the evidence for behavior change in multiple studies and peer review articles and peer review studies, conclusive is in fact the highest level of scientific consensus that a particular wellness activity or a particular intervention produces behavior change. And the cause-effect relationship between intervention and outcomes is supported by a substantial number of well-designed studies with randomized control groups. Nearly universal agreement by experts in the field regarding impact. So that's our conclusive status. We run into problems in the worksite in that we are not able to randomize control groups and subject groups. we essentially are prevented from giving something to somebody we don't give to other people. So that creates difficulties for us as we think about being able to have a peer-reviewed literature base that helps us establish the relationship between a particular kind of intervention in wellness and an outcome, a specific type of behavioral outcome, whether that's a short-term or long-term behavioral outcome. The next level of scientific consensus is what is called acceptable. And that's a cause-effect relationship supported by well-designed studies with randomized control groups. Agreement by a majority of experts in the field regarding the impact. So you can see the two-sided issue here of one, the existence of evidence in the scientific literature, and two, the ability to have agreement amongst people who are in fact perceived as experts in a particular field. The third level is what's called indicative. And that indicative essentially means relationships are supported by a substantial number of well-designed studies, but few or no studies with randomized control group. And this is more of the issue around what we run into in the worksite. A majority of experts in the field believe a causal relationship exists based on the evidence, but view it as tentative due to the lack of randomized studies and potential alternative explanations. So that's the context around this particular level of scientific consensus on the behavioral effectiveness of wellness programs. Suggestive means multiple studies with consistent relationships, but no well-designed studies with randomized control groups. A majority of experts in the field believe causal impact is consistent with knowledge in related areas, but see support as limited and acknowledge plausible explanations, alternative explanations for the observed change. So that's our suggestive level. Weak is that research supporting relationship is fragmentary, non-experimental, or poorly operationalized. A majority of experts in the field believe causal impact is plausible, but no more so than alternative explanations. So these are the three levels we're going to be looking at for the variety of areas of behavior change that wellness is attempting to achieve. And these, again, are going to be the terms we're going to see applied to these different summary of the evidence around behavior change by worksite wellness programs. Now, a summary of research reviews. This is the look at the reviews that were conducted by the Centers for Disease Control. And they found that hypertension control had a conclusive level of evidence in 32 peer-reviewed studies. Stress management, indicative to acceptable. Those are essentially the second and third level of evidence. 64 studies in that. Multi-component programs, and that's where we are addressing things like a combination of tobacco use and physical activity and weight management, nutrition, blood pressure, and so on. And that evidence there is determined to be indicative to acceptable. And then weight control, indicative with 28 studies. Nutrition and nutrition behavior change, suggestive to indicative, and that's 16 studies. Cholesterol, suggestive to indicative, 10 studies. Exercise, suggestive, 52 studies. You can see, obviously, the more of the issues around exercise, the high number of studies reported, as the stress management at 64 is also the highest. And then seatbelt use, suggestive, 14 studies. The use of health risk assessments, weak for standalone, suggestive for comprehensive programs, 11 studies. And then alcohol, weak to suggestive, 25 studies. HIV/AIDS education and AIDS intervention, weak with only 11 studies. So this summarizes the current literature search and reviews associated with some of the key behaviors that wellness programs are attempting to change, and the relative scientific consensus around their level of ability to change. Now, let's look at 4 keys to long-term behavior change, and this was developed as a construct by Michael O'Donnell, the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Health Promotion for a number of years, and now heading up the annual Art and Science of Health Promotion Conference. And his work with AMSO stands for the following things. In his extensive review of the literature, he found that the most highly probable kinds of activities that were associated with successful long-term behavior change in health promotion and wellness were, one, an ongoing method for raising awareness, and that's the A in AMSO, awareness of health and wellness issues for the individual. So having some sort of ongoing method for raising awareness was associated with a high level of ability to change long-term behavior across a broad spectrum of behavioral issues. The ability to enhance motivation is the M in AMSO, and that means that in addition to the approximately 20% of employees that are intrinsically motivated already for wellness, about 80% need to have additional reasons to become motivated to engage in wellness programming. And in general, that tends to be the use of incentives. So that motivation needs to augment what is already there in terms of intrinsic motivation. So the M in AMSO stands for the ability to enhance the level of motivation around wellness. The third area, the S in AMSO, corresponds with the ability for the program to teach and to convey new skills associated with the new wellness behavior. So once we have brought awareness to a level, we've enhanced motivation. The next step is helping people learn the new skills associated with the new behavior. And finally, the O in AMSO is an organized approach toward providing opportunity to practice those new behavioral skills. So if an individual program has a balance among these AMSO components, which is part of an AMSO construct, it is very likely to be producing long-term behavior change. So that to the extent that we can take this AMSO construct, overlay it over our wellness programs, and make sure that our programs are addressing these four keys, that has a lot to do with whether our programs produce long-term behavior change. Now, let's look at the behavioral effectiveness of eHealth portals. And this particular article I was involved in developing, it looks at 20,090 respondents that had access to a pretty extensive eHealth portal provided by their employer. And in answer to the following question, since you began using your employer's online health site, which of the following actions have you taken to maintain or improve your health? Select all that apply. Now, this is behavioral effectiveness of eHealth portals. It's primarily short-term response. So it's basically saying 43% of the 20,000 people have started an exercise program. Another 40% have changed their diet. Another 26% have scheduled a preventive exam. Another 26% have made no change. That's a quarter. So a quarter, 3/4 have made a change. 1/4 has not. Tracked their progress online. 22% took measures to deal with stress. 21% participated in a workplace health fair or screening exam. 13% reduced their alcohol consumption, 5%, and quit smoking, 4%. Now again, these are within a 18-month period. So this is not considered long-term behavior change, but it basically says, at least based on this sample of some 20,000 people, that there were significant numbers of initial health behaviors and health behavior changes associated with the use of an eHealth portal. Now, this particular visual and slide contains the 6 steps that we use in the WellCert program for designing wellness programs. And when we talk about behavior change, We basically are dealing with step one, setting the wellness strategy, which helps us choose a feel-good, a traditional, or a results-driven kind of program. And with each of those, they're progressively more powerful behaviorally. In terms of step two, are setting up the infrastructure, both the technology and virtual components and the organizational infrastructure, the administrative infrastructure are important in being able to sustain long-term behavior change. In step three, we are planning the marketing of the program and the communications around the program. So those are important for us in terms of helping people move toward behavior change. Step four is planning the health management process, and that's essentially building into the various components of the wellness program opportunities for people to track and to get feedback on their own behavior change. So in a way, this is building in a fairly strong type of process that will help people make behavior change. A lot of wellness programs also work on formulating goals and personal objectives around wellness. And that again is a technique that is associated with a higher order, higher level of behavior change. Step five is planning group activities, and group activities essentially reinforce our behavior change by providing accountability, inspiration, aspiration, the ability for us to work on specific elements. And finally, step six is where we basically come alongside of the various interventions that are in 1 through 5 and then add policy support, physical activity that reinforces behavior change, visible participation of management in the program, and the kinds of things that will again support the behavioral effectiveness of the wellness program. To the extent that we do each of these steps and we complete our planning and then implement it effectively, it's going to have a lot to do with whether it produces behavior change, both short and long term. Now, the program model will determine the behavior change as well, so we need to remember that the set of interventions gets more sophisticated as we move from left to right. So that if our approach to wellness parallels one of these three strategies or models, then the more we move to the right, the more we are likely to see greater behavioral effectiveness of our wellness activities. Now, let's summarize the key points from this particular module. There is a large body of literature that documents the behavioral effectiveness of wellness interventions. The program model and quality of interventions will have a lot to do with the long-term behavioral effectiveness of wellness programs. And some of the behavioral targets of wellness programs are easier to change for the short term rather than the long term. And other important dimensions include the degree of cultural support, the strength of incentives used, and the program's follow-up activities. Each type of behavior change has some unique aspects which must be addressed by programming interventions. And habit formation is an important part of long-term behavior change. We saw that habit formation in the use of cues, routines, and rewards. Habit formation and change utilize cues, routines, and rewards. We still need additional research to find more effective long-term techniques for behavioral change. And AMSO definitely helps enhance the long-term behavioral effectiveness of employer wellness efforts. Now, let's answer some key questions. The first question is, what are the rudiments of short and long-term behavior change? In order to think this through, I see the short-term rudiments of behavior change as including cues, barriers and overcoming barriers, routines, and rewards. So if we think of the rudiments of short-term behavior change, I am re-engineering, redesigning cues. I'm removing barriers to the new behavior. I'm setting up routines that are moving from more unhealthy to healthy. And I'm working on retooling, reshaping, strengthening the rewards which govern that short-term behavior. If I move those areas and continue them for a long period of time, I have helped move to more of the rudiments of long-term behavior change. And additional rudiments of long-term behavior change, I believe, are attached to the AMSO construct. So I need to have that continual and reoccurring process of raising awareness around wellness issues. I need to have the ability to enhance the existing intrinsic motivation that exists in the population with extrinsic sources of motivation. I need to help people learn the new skills associated with the new routine or the new behavior. And then I need to have them help organize opportunities for practicing those new skills so that those new skills on repetition actually become the long-term habits that we want to build with wellness programming. What general level of behavior change should we expect from our typical wellness program? And in general, I think our short-term expectation for change should be somewhere in the area of 15% to 45% of people actually making a short-term behavior change. When it comes to long-term behavior change, I think our expectation is more in the area of 3% to 12% of the population actually sustaining the long-term behavior change. I do believe that this also varies by the type of behavior. So the range that you are in is oftentimes determined by the difficulty of the behavior and the way in which each behavior varies in terms of its pattern of short-term and long-term behavior change. How can we increase the behavioral change effectiveness of employee wellness programs? And I have 7 suggestions for that. The first one is to eliminate the barriers that go along to the new healthy behavior. So I need to be barrier-free in terms of creating environments and situations where people have the barriers removed. Secondly, I think we want to increase the level of incentives. I think incentives reach into that 80% that are generally not intrinsically motivated for wellness. And the stronger we can design those incentives with the right pay values and the right magnitude of rewards, the better off we will ultimately be. The third way of increasing the effectiveness of the behavioral change component of programs is to move to that results-driven wellness model. So it's moving away from the feel-good model, the traditional model, to the results-driven. The fourth method is to match the intrinsics with offers. So whatever intrinsic reasons people have for wanting to make a change in a health-related behavior, then we need to be able to match that intrinsic reason with some offers that allow them in small bite-sized pieces to progress toward more change. Fifth, I think we need to follow that 6-step method of being able to design programs so that we make sure we put into the program things which are going to lead to long-term, to short-term and long-term behavior change. Sixth, I think we need to increase the level of integration of our programs so that they are actually embedded more deeply in our work cultures and essentially change the way in which our programs interact with other services and other areas that are complementary. And seventh is to actually change the cultural norms around wellness. So our ability to effectively do that and have that lead to a combination with each of these 7 things, I believe that's how we will get to increased levels of effectiveness of our and behavioral effectiveness of our employee wellness programs. Now that you completed this module, go ahead and take the quiz.